Bianchi, a district sales manager for Quality Liquid Feeds, and I cover southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. With me today is John Benversi, who is a dairy technical services manager for QLF. QLF is proud to be the only liquid feed company that's based in Wisconsin. We're based actually in Dodgeville. We're the only family-owned company, we're the family-owned company that now has 17 plants across the U.S., and we work alongside nutritionists to provide support to help producers increase their bottom line by working to increase milk yield and components. Now, on behalf of Quality Liquid Feeds, I'd like to introduce both Madeline Daly and Helen Lundell, who will kick off the sessions today. Madeline Daly is a Senior Vice President of Strategic Intelligence for Dairy Management Incorporated with a deep understanding of consumer and cultural trends and marketplace dynamics. Madeline fulfills a strategic role in scoping, synthesizing, and interpreting information, driving critical insights to grow dairy consumption. Most recently, Madeline and her team are responsible for grounding DMI and consumer views on health and sustainability that can influence overall consumer trust in the dairy industry. Prior to DMI, Madeline managed consumer research for the Quaker Quick Oats and Captain Crunch brands and helped guide the development of new cereals. She also worked in the McKinsey & Company's research group, analyzing the competitive landscape of industries and underlying trends. Madeline holds a bachelor's degree in math from the Illinois Institute of Technology and an MBA from the University of Chicago. Now, Helen Lundell is a senior consultant at the Hartman Group and is a seasoned researcher. She launched her market research career in London following an undergraduate degree at the University of Cambridge. She has postgraduate degrees in both public relations from the University of Stirling and communication from Cornell University. During her time with the Hartman Group, Helen has led many of Hartman's syndicated studies and custom research projects, as well as engaging in ongoing consultation with a range of clients as part of Hartman Retainer Services team. Please help me in welcoming both Helen and Madeline.
Good morning. Before we start here today, I would just like to set the stage a little bit with regards to the presentation that you're going to be hearing from Helen Lundell. So at DMI, we're trying to develop an intelligence system that cuts across consumers, what's happening in the marketplace, and really put it into the context of what's happening in the broader landscape of food and of other forces that are really shaping what's happening in food culture today. And as you can see here, we stretch across many different areas. So we try to look at global insights. So for example, as we think about what's happening in the United States today, we oftentimes realize that some of these trends actually are occurring in Europe or parts of Asia before they actually even hit the United States. So trying to get a little bit of insight into what's happening in these other countries, I think, is helpful to us in terms of preparing for perhaps some concerns that might be coming along the way, or also allows us to try to leverage the opportunity by understanding how we can put this into the context of what consumers really care about today. We also try to take a gauge of where consumers' heads are at with regards to not only our industry, but also what's happening in food at large. Part of it is just understanding the overall culture of food, understanding the consumer, how to fit within their lifestyles, that they're becoming relevant to them today and also relevant for the United States dairy industry as well. We try to pick up channel intelligence. So for example, we think about what's happening in the retail space in our own country here, but also what's happening in Europe. So for example, right now, there's a little bit of a war on plastic that's going on. People are concerned about what's happening in terms of the oceans and what's happening in terms of environment at large. That might be something that comes down the pike and actually is going to start influencing our industry. So again, trying to stay a little bit ahead of what's happening there. Also food service. As we'll hear from Helen today, much of her experience is understanding what's happening at the culinary, what's happening with premium ingredients that are taking place as well. Because oftentimes, many of the trends that first start out in the food service space tend to also trail down to what's happening at retail and with the consumer at large. And again, as I said, understanding just this general external landscape that's out there today. So what's happening with regards to the demographics, there's a lot of shifting that's going on, a lot of change within the United States, a lot of change of us within kind of that larger landscape of the globe. So all of these pulling together help us to provide a better picture of what's happening with that consumer. And why is that important to us? It's important to try to stay relevant with that consumer, to stay within their life today. So for example, if we think about the latest data that we have right now that provides a really complete picture of 2017 dairy industry performance, it was the highest point that we ever had in history with regards to dairy consumption. We want to keep that very strong as we move forward. So again, understanding our consumer is going to help us take us there. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Helen, who'll take us through an understanding of where consumers are with regards to health and wellness and sustainability. And I'll be back a little bit later, and we'll also be here to answer any questions that might come up. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you all hear me? Yes. Those at the back? Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Madeline and Sabrina. And also, thank you very much to the previous presenter we had here. For those of you who were here, it's going to provide an excellent segue into the stuff that we're talking about today. And the goal of this presentation is really to understand how consumers are thinking about food and how food culture is working today. Because as we all know, consumers know very little about dairy, but they do have lots of ideas and ideals about how food should work. And so in order to stay relevant to them, as Madeline said, and to remain relevant and resonant, you really need to meet them where they are and understand some of the big things that are happening in food culture today. So yeah, today we're going to look at health and wellness, sustainability, explore a little bit more deeply some of those forward-leaning consumer ideals about animals and agriculture, and then sum it all up with where we go next. So let's start with health and wellness today. The big picture of what health and wellness is, what it is to feel well, and how consumers feel they should go about attaining it. The very big picture. So if we're talking at a very high level about what makes health and wellness unique today, we look at sort of then, a few decades ago versus now. In the past, health used to be more about taking a defensive stance against threats to your wellness. So you have this kind of health status quo that is under threat from injury, illness, aging, and the idea is you're fighting those things off. And you think about things pretty simplistically. So if you have an elbow problem, you go to the doctor and you ask for elbow treatments. Everything's pretty simple, mechanistic, and about being reactive to problems outside your body. Now, we hear a lot more consumers talking about their bodies as being kind of constantly changing, more organic, something that needs to be constantly nurtured and nourished so that it can be consistently resilient and that they can feel better on a day-to-day level. They don't want to feel bad anymore. They want to think about how to make their lives better. So it's a much more proactive approach and a lot more self-assessed approach. And that broader definition is really represented in how consumers define health and wellness. So as you can see, not being ill is definitely high up on the list, but it sits in there amongst all these other broader things like feeling good about yourself, leading a balanced lifestyle, having energy for an active lifestyle, and being able to deal with stress. Health isn't just about diet and exercise anymore. As you can see, 80% of consumers believe that mental and emotional balance is as important as physical health is. Again, that broader definition of health is also represented in what consumers say about how they think they should go about attaining better health. And this is all based on a mixture of survey research, so quantitative data, but also qualitative research. We spend a lot of time in people's homes, we talk to them for 2.5 hours, we go shopping with them, we get them to do homeworks that talk about their life as they go about them. So this is where all of these things are coming from. And when you ask them about what it is that they can do to feel better, they definitely talk about real food, good food, and that comes front row center, physical movement, and of course supportive healthcare, but also these things like restful sleep. We've been hearing so much more about that recently. Sleep being something that not just makes you feel good in the morning, but changes your entire quality of life. social engagement, having meaningful relationships with those around you so that you're feeling positivity as you go about your day. And then also mental practice, which sounds a little woo-woo, but it doesn't have to mean like having a meditation practice every day. It can mean just consciously thinking about having a positive attitude and how your attitude can influence your day-to-day life. So all of these things work together to sort of build up a core of feeling well. So again, part of that broader definition of health and wellness means that consumers are also listening to a broader array of health authorities. More people today are allowed to know and be experts in health and wellness. So when we ask consumers about the top information sources they use to learn about health and wellness, there are lots of predictable things here. The doctor, the online searches, health internet sites, immediate family members, all the sorts of people you can traditionally imagine people going to for health advice. But we start to see something interesting when we ask consumers about who they trust for their health information, particularly when you look at young consumers. Because those consumers are more likely than other generations, so that younger cohort that's coming up and becoming more influential in the world, say that are more likely than others to trust people like alternative health practitioners and their online social networks. So they're getting health information from a broader array of sources who may or may not have scientific backgrounds, but have their own take on what it is to be healthy and well. And this diversity of information sources, as well as the sense that health advice is always changing, the sense that I went to the doctor and I asked for advice about this thing and he told me to do something and it didn't work, all of these things are coming together to make people feel like, you know what, I'm a unique body. I have unique genetics, I have a unique context around me. So while there is good advice out there for what can work for you and what can make you feel better, ultimately, I'm the best judge of what the best way forward is. Yes, I can listen to my doctor, yes, I can listen to those around me, but ultimately those are more kind of starting points for understanding myself. And what I need to do next is listen to my body and figure out what works for me. Try it out. So there's become this kind of democratization of health knowledge and this idea that consumers have the power over their own health and wellness. Okay, so that's the very big picture, just to set the stage of some of the key things that are happening in health and wellness today. But I want to pause now and talk for a moment about a tool that we use at the Hartman Group to understand differences between consumers and how we group them in terms of their attitudes and behaviors. And we do this because, first of all, it helps you understand differences in target audiences and the different ways that you should be talking to consumers who have different views, but also because it can help us understand something about where trends come from and how they form. Because one of the groups that we look at is that evangelist group that knows all the new stuff that's happening, and it can be an influencer on the other groups. So at the Hartman Group, for every topic, for every sphere of ideas, we say that there is a world. We say there's a world of consumers. And the world of health and wellness, there's a world of sustainability, a world of natural foods. And within every world, there are a number of degrees of engagement that consumers can have. So those who are in the middle, the core, are really, really into it. They know everything about it, they research it, they think about it, they talk about it, and importantly, their behaviors often follow their goals and their aspirations. So they have real follow-through on all of their knowledge and all the things that they know, or at least they think they know. Then on the periphery, we have the other group of people. Of course, yes, everybody is engaged in some way with the health and wellness, but the periphery folks are going to be thinking much less about it. They're really just going about their day-to-day lives. They're not learning a lot about health and wellness. And so all of these different groups have different attitudes and different behaviors around health and wellness that will change how you would talk about a product to them, change how you would connect with them as consumers. So just to build that out a little more, when we look at our core consumers in health and wellness, we find that they're more proactive, they're more empowered about their sense of their ability to make changes to their health and wellness, they're much more knowledgeable, they're much more disciplined, they think of their body in more complex ways, and interestingly, they've often spent so much time learning about how to make themselves feel better that they've started learning arguments for why their actions are not just good for them, but they're good for the world. So they tend to be motivated by products that are purer, they perceive to be more authentic, be made by more responsible suppliers and manufacturers, at least in their eyes. The periphery, on the other hand, tend to be more reactive. Health is just something that kind of happens to them and they deal with it as they go along. More sporadic bursts of being interested, and tend to be most motivated by present physical concerns. Something hurts, I want to make it feel better. And when they're shopping, they're more motivated by price, convenience, having the things that they've always had before, familiarity. So why is this useful? Because it helps us think about, first of all, where the biggest opportunity is in terms of sales. And unsurprisingly, we define the biggest opportunity as being in the middle, the people who aren't on the two extremes, but are kind of pretty into health and wellness to varying degrees. So that's where the biggest opportunity typically is for products. But the core, these folks who are really, really highly invested in health and wellness, are also interesting because they're always on the cutting edge, because they're always listening to the new things that are happening from various sources. The way they talk about issues can often be influential on some of the values that the people in the middle ultimately end up holding. So, the core do a bunch of crazy stuff, and not everything is going to become a mainstream phenomenon. But sometimes there are little pieces, little kernels of their behaviors and attitudes that become much more relevant, that can become relevant in the mainstream in the future. And so they can be useful to look at for ideas about where the future is going. So here, this is actually a little collage of items from a guy's home who I went into a couple of years ago. He was a core consumer, and we asked him to get out all of the items in his household that he really strongly associated with health and wellness. Again, we use this for clues as to what's going to be exciting for folks in the future, and there are a lot of themes here that are going to be resonant throughout the rest of our presentation. So what do we see? Bunch of protein. Virtually no carbohydrates except in the form of vegetables. We have a lot of animal quality cues, grass-fed, locally sourced meat. We have kombucha over there, that's a real example of something that, 10 years ago was only in the wackiest people's houses. It was this weird cloudy thing with the gross SCOBY at the bottom, and now it's been turned into this product that's kind of just like soda and feels like a healthy alternative. So yes, the weird core kombucha didn't make it into the mainstream, but it translated itself into mainstream consumer culture over time. And then when we look at dairy, we see fermented, unsweetened dairy. And you'll notice that even here, he has some kefir and some full-fat plain yogurt, neither of which is organic. But there are some cues here for things that are important to folks. So that's just a nice kind of real-world example of what it looks like to look in a core consumer's home. Okay, so now we have our setup. Now we're going to dig a little bit more deeper into the role of food in health and wellness for consumers today. And there's no doubt that food is playing a much bigger role in health and wellness than it ever has before. Consumers are blaming food for doing more things to their bodies, and also looking to food to heal more things in their bodies than they ever have before. But the question then is, well, what sort of foods are they looking for, and what do they think it's going to do? There is no doubt, and this is going to be no surprise to you, that consumers are looking for things that they perceive to be more natural, less processed, more like real food than in the past. So they're looking for things that are locally grown, minimally processed, have a short ingredient list, antibiotic-free, hormone-free, as we've discussed, non-GMO certified. All of these things, even if they don't know that much about them, say to them, this is a product that hasn't been processed, that is more like the real thing. And why does that matter? Because yes, the nutrition list is extremely important. They're looking at the food groups and all that sort of thing. What is it about something that's a fresh food that seems healthier to folks? And they do have this sense that there is something about something that's been made by nature that is just intuitively going to work better for your body. The nutrients that are in there are going to be more available to you. There's something about the way they're put together that makes them make sense for your body. So it's about kind of the things between the lines on the nutritional facts panel that they think freshness contributes. And it's also about the things that aren't in the product. So they think that something that's more natural and is a more real whole food isn't going to have some of the things in here that they're concerned about. And that shows up in the growth in organic foods. Yes, organic foods have become way more available in grocery stores, and the number of people who say they never buy organic has gone down over time. 38% of people perceive at least that they are buying more organic than they were a year ago. But the important thing about this statistic is not that they're buying more organic, but why they're buying more organic. And you can see here when you ask them why people who are buying organic do, it's because they want to avoid pesticides and other chemicals, that it's safer, that they avoid antibiotics, hormones, and genetically modified products. Things that they think have been made by man and put into their food are what they're trying to avoid. And the same goes for natural, a similar list of items. So then the question is, what do they think that these things are going to do to them? Clearly, they don't think they're going to drop dead the next time they eat a conventional strawberry. That isn't what's going to happen. But they have this sense that all of these things, none of which they really understand individually, over time, if you eat loads of stuff with loads of those things in, it might just tip the balance in your body towards something not working quite right, that over the course of a lifetime might accumulate into something meaningful. Things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes. And in the short term, it's possible that we're hearing less about this, but that they might make you feel bad. It might just be the difference between, feeling really good one day, feeling really on it, and not feeling really on it that day. So none of it is life or death. It's just this sense that if you eat stuff with these things in all the time, then they're probably going to work together in a way that isn't going to be good for you. And importantly, this is an argument that it's very, very difficult for science to argue against, because there are too many factors over too long term, too much context going on. So ultimately, it's a non-falsifiable belief. It's about trust, ultimately. And that's something that's really important. And so all of these things that we looked at, consumers want less processing, fewer chemicals. The interesting thing is that their belief in these things has created a sense of disconnect between them and traditional health authorities. Because when consumers look back at what they were taught about nutrition, and obviously my plate is actually the more updated version of the food pyramid, but consumers look back and they think of their education growing up, and they think of the food pyramid as being the icon of that. They look at that, and there's nothing on there that says it should be fresh, or that it should be less processed, or that it should be better quality. Whoops. And so they look at that and they think, well, the people who are telling me what to eat aren't understanding how I think about food. And some other things that they see when they think about this, a sort of disconnect between what they hear from, what they perceive they hear from traditional authorities and what they hear in the air, is a sense that they were always told that carbohydrates were more important than they should be. The animal products are more important than they need to be, even though they have an iconic place in their life. They don't need to be the biggest piece of your life. They feel like the negatives of fats were overemphasized. Fat's okay now. So why did everyone always tell me that fat wasn't okay? They also thought it underemphasized, as I said, the importance of food quality. It didn't go far enough into talking about the dangers of sugars, and it didn't talk at all about the social and the environmental impact of food and food choices. And that's not as influential for mainstream consumers, but for core consumers, they really feel like, wait, if we're talking about how to eat, all of these things have to be incorporated into our overall guidance for how we think about food. So today, if we think about how consumers are thinking about managing their own diet and the proportions within it, it goes back again to that idea of a sense of uniqueness, that nobody should really have to eat the same way. You should eat for your own body type, your own context, and the things that work for you. But those things should be sort of guided and molded by some key principles. The first, as we've said, is that things should be as fresh and as less processed as possible, so things that are closest to their natural form. That things should be nutrient dense, that bite for bite you should be getting a greater variety of nutrients and not be loading up on empty carbohydrates. Thirdly, that what you eat across your diet should be diverse, both a range of nutrients across the day and across the week, but also food should be exciting and interesting, that you should be eating for pleasure and for keeping life interesting. That the foods you eat should be digestion and energy supporting, because without that, your life can't work well. So you should be eating foods that make you feel good and give you the energy to feel focused and optimized on a daily basis. And finally, for the core, that the foods you eat should be made responsibly, whether that means animal welfare or human rights or anything like that. So what goes in the pyramid is pretty up for grabs, but it should be guided by some of those principles. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what consumers actually say that they're avoiding, at least in the survey context. So the things that people are avoiding are basically the things that they also talk about as being signs of processing, which is sugars, artificial ingredients, saturated bad fats, and sodium. And it should be pointed out that they don't think of dairy as being a processed product. Dairy is a simple, natural product. And even this concern about saturated fat, we've over time been hearing a lot more positive things about saturated fat. And often when people are saying they want to avoid saturated fat, they're thinking about a kind of greasy fast food meal, rather than like coconut oil, which is extremely high in saturated fat, has a huge health halo. So it's really about the bad saturated fats that they're avoiding here. When we ask consumers what ingredients and foods they're trying to add to their diet, we see things that all kind of work together to promote good digestion and sustained energy. So again, moving away from that culture of eating lots of sugar and carbohydrates to a world where we have sustained energy without crashes, and where we feel good and level throughout the day. And within this list, you can see, so that's like protein, fiber, and healthy fats are some of the key things there. And the things we've highlighted here are all highly relevant to dairy: protein, vitamin D, calcium, healthy fats, probiotics. So there are so many things here that are just totally in alignment with the dairy industry. Then, if we look at the eating approaches or diets that consumers have tried in the last 12 months, we see, first of all, that lots of people have tried one. 44% of consumers have in the last year tried some sort of dietary approach. And a lot of them reflect some of the principles that we've already been talking about. So low carb, gluten-free, keto, paleo even are often about reducing carbohydrates, having more protein, better fats. And then there's also a focus on fresher, less processed foods, which is often part and parcel of becoming vegetarian, eating the whole foods diet, doing a juice cleanse, becoming vegan, or the paleo diet, raw and living foods. Now, it may be concerning that dairy and lactose-free is fairly high up on the list and rising. But what I wanted to say about that and often that's also driven by some sense that dairy might not make you feel good, and that it's something that's worth trying out removing. But what we should say about it is that, of course, lactose-free doesn't mean dairy-free, and also it's not like these people are falling off a cliff into a dairy-free life. Often they're trying it out because it's in the air as one of those things that you might want to try cutting out and seeing what difference it makes. But it often they realize that it's not dairy that's making them feel bad, it's a whole diet of eating more processed foods that's making them feel bad, and often dairy works its way back in, maybe not in exactly the same form, but dairy is still part of their life afterwards. So I wanted to look a little bit more at our core consumers again, because they're the folks who we look to for learning about how language is changing around health and wellness. And everything we've said so far applies to them, probably just with greater intensity. But one thing to note is that the way they talk about what bad foods do to them and how good foods help them is often in terms of these systemic health ideas. So things like digestion and metabolism, not just does it make my tummy feel good, but the microbiome, how is it affecting my gut flora? Because they think of that as being connected to all the other systems in their body. Then they think a lot about systemic inflammation, the idea that some foods can just make your whole body react badly, which can make you feel stuffy, it can make your joints ache. So things can work in a kind of counterintuitive way. It's not just if your knee hurts, then you fix it, it's that there might be something in your diet that's making your whole system not work properly. And then also hormonal systems as well. So all of these things are just a more holistic approach to the body and how diet can have a role in that. The other thing about the core consumers, which we mentioned earlier, is that they're also more likely to make arguments about how they behave in terms of not just how it's good for them, but how it's good for the rest of the world as well. And that sort of argument, that like reinforcement of the health and wellness behaviors that they're doing with sustainability arguments, is something that we're seeing spreading into the mainstream. So things like organic food and beverages. I like them because for me, I avoid ingesting toxic chemicals, and I think it might be more nutritious, but I also think it's better for the ecosystem and for farm workers. Animal welfare is important because I think no hormones are healthier for some reason, and it may be more nutritious. But also, I think the animals shouldn't suffer, and that the pollution and water waste that occurs because of them is negative. Finally, buying local is important because I think the foods are fresher, it's fun to buy them from the farmer's market, but it also reduces pollution from transportation costs and supports local families and businesses. And whether these are right or wrong, the idea that sustainability is building into some of the same arguments consumers are using about health and wellness means that sustainability is something that we need to look at in more depth. And even if it isn't translating into purchase decisions, as we found in the previous presentation, knowing how they orient to those issues and what they want to hear about them is important for meeting them where they are. So let's talk about sustainability today. First off, 74% of people claim that sometimes sustainability features into their purchase decisions. And I don't think that we should think of that as being, I go to the shelf and I think, which is the sustainable one? Shall I buy it or not? Really, this just reflects the sense that consumers want to be thinking about sustainability when they're buying things. And if they buy something that they perceive as being sustainable, it makes them feel better about that purchase, and it makes them feel better about the brand that they're buying. So it's not a sort of a mechanistic, I see it, I buy it. It's a much more nebulous, kind of slow burn effect. And those who say that they do take sustainability into account, it's worth noting, are more likely to be millennial, more likely to be people with children under 18 in their household, and they're more likely to be politically liberal. So thinking about the word sustainability itself, the consumer familiarity with that term is higher than it has ever been before. 83% of consumers are familiar with the word. But interestingly, only 21% can think of a sustainable product when you ask them to, and only 13% can identify a sustainable company. And that feeds into that same thing as I was just saying. It's like sustainability hasn't filtered into the specifics of people's buying yet. They know they should feel something about it, but it hasn't translated into this product I buy for this reason. This is the company that I support for this reason. And that will probably happen more over time as people talk more about it. And interestingly, so when you ask them what sustainability means, the words that come out are often things that are associated with the environment. So kind of green things like conserving natural resources, recycling and reusing, reducing your carbon footprint. So when you use that word, those are the things that pop into consumers' minds. But the things that consumers are interested in when they're thinking about how companies and manufacturers and producers behave is actually much broader than that. So yes, of course, the environmental component is part of it, but there are also these other areas. The economic area, like is a company being economically responsible within its community and within the country? Socially, is a company thinking about its workers and thinking about the animals and thinking about the people who feel things around them and along the production process? And then also, crucially, I think what often happens in talking about sustainability is that people think about the benefits to the consumer as being completely separate from the ideas of helping social, economic, and environmental justice, whereas consumers really integrate them deeply within the same topics. And so they see the responsibility of a company to help them and give them a quality product as being part of the company's ability to do good in the world. And those areas of sustainability that are most resonant to them are those that touch on more than one of those areas. And in particular, they usually have to touch on the personal as well. It's not enough to be compelling to be just socially responsible or economically responsible. It has to translate into doing something for me as well. It has to tell them the product is better quality. So when we look at the issues that are actually important to consumers, or that they say are important to them when they're buying products, first of all, unsurprisingly, it's that a company provides quality products. So the first thing that's most important to them is, are you doing a baseline good job to meet my quality criteria? But then when we look at the things that are growing, this gives us a clue about the sorts of issues we should be talking about to help consumers think about what we're doing and feel good about the products we're making. And the top one here, which has gone up 9 points since, I think it's 2015, is avoiding inhumane treatment of animals, providing safe working conditions, providing good wages and benefits, trying to reduce pollution, trying to reduce the impact of production, and having a company that truly cares about the communities where it does business. So these are some of the key themes that consumers want to hear more about. And it's interesting that the inhumane treatment of animals is high, and we see that across our studies and across questions. And just to reinforce that idea, we ask consumers, first of all, which certifications they're aware of, and then what their perception is of how much impact that has on their purchasing. And you can see these animal welfare items are both pretty high up there in those which are well known. They're also high up there, though, in terms of consumers' perception of how it influences their purchases. So they at least feel like it's something that's making a difference to them and is meaningful. And we talked a little bit, it was talked a little bit out in the previous presentation about needing to be more transparent. And so then the question becomes, what do consumers want to hear you be transparent about? And we find that, first of all, it's these key things. What stuff is in the product? That's what I want to know first and foremost. What's in it? How good is it? But then how the animals in the products were treated, and the involvement of the company in the community, those kind of social, environmental responsibility items come next. And then items around sourcing, labor practices, and ownership and affiliations. So there is hierarchy within there, but I think the overall message that being transparent is something that consumers want is definitely an important one. And finally, we just wanted to look again at our core consumers and listen to some of the issues that they're talking about, so that we can think about some of the issues that are going to become more resonant over time. And these are just some ideas, some of which are more present now, like labor issues, and some of which are more on the fringe. So GMOs are obviously something consumers are thinking about, but the idea of glyphosate and that being a problem is something that consumers are learning more about as it spends more time in the courts and as there's more activist publicity around it. Things around monoculture and deforestation. There's been a lot around palm oil recently that's raising the profile of that in the media. And so these are all just things that we would recommend watching because we've been hearing about them, but also because we perceive them to have some cultural resonance, because they touch on a number of those items of sustainability. They kind of impact from multiple angles and have that emotional resonance. Okay, so I want to finish by thinking a little bit about how consumers are thinking about animals and agriculture specifically. And again, you are the experts in animals and agriculture. Consumers are not the experts in animals and agriculture. But you need to know their ideas, their visions, their values, to know who you're talking to and where to meet them. So it's worth saying that when consumers think about how animals are treated, this is one of those key areas where they really think animals being treated well makes a better product for them. They think that animals that haven't been treated with antibiotics and hormones, that have been fed foods that let the animal live like they were living in a pasture in the world, and that they're not confined and they're not stressed, they're slaughtered in a humane way, all of these things that you're thinking about and making progress on, all of those things translate into the idea of a better product for them. Even if they wouldn't pay more for it, they might be in store and they see the one with those cues on, and they know that, or they think that that's the superior product or the higher quality product, even if they don't think it's worth paying more money for. So these are some of the things that kind of feed into that image. And that's pretty mainstream. But core consumers are consumers who are really highly engaged with all the things that are going on in sustainability. They've started talking more about ecosystems. And importantly, they're also talking about soil. So they're not even talking about how animals are treated specifically or how plants are grown, what pesticides are put on them. They're saying, if we're not creating an ecosystem that creates healthy soil, into which there are so many different components and so many things going on, then we are not creating a viable and healthy food system for ourselves. So as this lady says, when the soil is allowed to be healthy, it becomes regenerative. Taking away from the soil impacts our food and the health of our food, its nutrients, and also the health of the planet. So they're starting to talk about things in more systemic ways and use things like soil as a symbol of, we need to be thinking about our agricultural system from the ground up, not just in siloed departments. And so animal welfare within that is, they think that animals should be treated in such a way that they create a healthy and self-sustaining ecosystem. Now, this is a dream. Yes, it is represented in some very, very niche certifications like Demeter Biodynamic and the Regenerative Organic Certified. But really, this is an idea that pops into their head when they're thinking about how, in some utopian world, we would live. There'd be a farmer who loves his land, working on the farm with animals who fertilize the soil, diverse rotating crops all feeding into each other. The farming changes with each season, and it's all responsive and interactive, and then the farmer eats his own food and sells it to the community. So this kind of self-sustaining, holistic, self-contained system. But even they know that this isn't realistic for how to feed a country. They know that this is a dream, and it's something that you can go and buy your farmer's market thing every now and again, but this isn't a real way to do the world. And only a very niche set of consumers are even thinking this way. But the point for us is that there are things that we can learn from this image about the sorts of values that are going to be important to consumers going down the line. This image of the farmer who's an expert, who's deeply engaged with his land and deeply engaged with his animals, deeply engaged with his own community, which of course you are, is something that resonates with consumers. This idea of a farmer being engaged with his community, thinking about how he interacts with his society, his community, his country, all of these things are things that resonate with consumers. So the point is not to think that everyone's going to want biodynamic food. It's to look at these images and think, what can I learn from this about what is appealing to consumers and how to talk to them? Okay, so key takeaways from all this. First of all, consumers are personalizing their approaches to health and wellness and listening to a more diverse set of authorities. For you to learn more about where consumers are and how to reach them means also knowing who they're listening to and keeping abreast of who the authorities are, who's allowed to know and set quality standards for food today in consumers' minds. The second is that when you think about your consumer, it is easy to think about them in terms of demographics and where they are geographically, but it's also important to think about where they are in terms of their involvement with health and wellness, sustainability, or whichever angle you're thinking about that day, because that will help you think harder about those groups of attitudes and behaviors that can help you reach them more effectively. Of course, and this is no news to you, the language of fresh, real, less processed food is how consumers talk about what it is to eat healthfully today. And so the more you can sort of feed into that language system, the more you're going to be able to speak consumers' language. 4, consumers are looking for diverse, nutrient-dense foods that support their digestion and energy as part of a fulfilling lifestyle. And we were talking about protein, good fats, fiber. And something I meant to say is that that's particularly relevant in the world of snacking. Consumers are spending much more time thinking about their snacks today. This world that was previously dominated by very carb-heavy, empty calories, they're putting a lot more protein and sort of treating snacks as more like a balanced meal than they ever have before, which explains to some extent the success of things like drinkable yogurt and snacking cheeses. So that's a real place where protein, particularly from dairy, which is a natural food source, it feels unprocessed and like a healthy option in comparison to other snacks, that's a place where dairy has a real opportunity. So interest in sustainability and transparency is still growing, even if it isn't directly translating into purchases. But importantly, the word sustainability itself has limited scope. So no matter how much sustainability work you're doing, bear in mind that the word sustainability itself may not be communicating the breadth of activities that you're taking part in. And importantly, when you are talking about sustainability, understand that consumers respond to those actions that are both good for the world, for animals, society, and the community, but ultimately, the argument has to be for why it's good for them. Yes, we're making a difference in the world, but also we're making a better product for you that tastes better, that's healthier, that's more convenient. Finally, animal welfare is, as we've said throughout the session, an increasingly important issue for consumers today. It means something to them. And in the future, they might be interested not just in how animals were treated, but also how those animals interacted with the ecosystem around them. At the moment, that's very limited to a core group of people, but that's just something to be thinking about as we move forward. Even the baby food producer, Gerber, is it Gerber or Gerber? Gerber. Thank you. They had an ad campaign that talked about the soil that the vegetables were grown in that goes into their baby food. So even like that kind of mainstream category that's very sensitive, obviously, to those sorts of cues, is buying into them. So it's not like, this isn't a totally out there idea. It's already in the kind of mainstream consumer food market. And now I'll hand it back to Madeline to wrap us up.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Thanks for providing perspective on the consumer and what they're thinking about today in the world of health and wellness and sustainability. The reason why we try to deepen our knowledge of the consumer is really to try to enhance decision making. So as we look at the dairy industry, how can we, in fact, make better informed decisions by understanding our key customers? We also want to bring value in terms of looking at what's on the horizon for consumers and how, in fact, can that help us to grow again the overall category. I'd like to show you some ways that information or insights of this nature really help to inspire some action within the industry overall. So what we're looking at here, first of all, would be farm. We've heard quite a bit from both the earlier speaker, I should say, as well as Helen, about the importance of animal care from a consumer perspective. And we know that the farm program is establishing very important standards that provide very high quality care and representing your industry in a very positive fashion. This is something that's very meaningful from a consumer perspective. So again, a nice linkage between what we're hearing from consumers as well as what the industry is doing overall. Other things, you may have already visited the booth that we have, but the Undeniably Dairy booth. It's a campaign that we have right now for representing the dairy industry overall. I know it's very active in the state of Wisconsin in particular, and this campaign is really building on many of the platforms or pillars that are important to consumers. So for example, you saw that consumers are looking for foods that are very nutrient rich, and dairy qualities are very much a part of that. We also saw that consumers want to make sure that the companies or industries that they're buying their food from are very responsible in terms of the way that they're producing those foods. Again, an important pillar of that campaign. But yet consumers recognize too that taste is really the reason and enjoyment why they're consuming those foods. So kind of bringing it together in a fashion that's very palatable from that consumer standpoint. And again, local is something that is helping to drive that campaign. And as I said a little bit earlier, within this state, a very active campaign. We also heard about how there are new influencers in the market today. So as we approach any of our communication platforms, one thing that we continue to work on is some of the traditional thought leaders in the space, for example, of health and wellness. So we'll continue to work with all of the top health organizations, the health professionals, pediatrician organizations, family physicians, and importantly, the dietitians as well. But yet we're also looking to who are those kind of emerging thought leaders in that space. So as we look at the areas of culinary and we look at fitness and nutrition, there are many new people who are starting to become influencers. Oftentimes they're people who don't necessarily have the credentials that we might see in terms of health professionals, but yet they too are in fact influencing overall consumers with their views. So we want to make sure that we understand who are the most active people on social media, who they're bringing in terms of followers, and how can we help to kind of influence or share with them information that provides the best light for the dairy industry overall. We also want to make sure that we're broadening the discussion. So oftentimes when you hear anything that's out there in the media about the environment, and you'll hear about plant-based products and diets that are really more responsible in terms of what they're providing in terms of environmental cues, we also want to make sure that the nutrition story doesn't get lost, because that's really where the dairy industry wins, bringing together the strong nutrition credentials that you have along with how, in fact, you are improving the overall environment and making for a healthy planet is a story that consumers want to hear, and you're probably the best ones in the room to be able to tell that story. And then finally, we heard again a little bit earlier today about the importance of trying to bring that farm-to-table connection. So bridging that gap, the consumers today don't necessarily have any kind of connection with what's happening in the rural community. Many of them, more so than ever before, are living in urban areas. So the more that we can provide on that story of how that food is being produced is going to resonate quite loudly with them. And also, just want to kind of bring to your attention as well what's happening in the school systems today. One of our earlier speakers was talking about how, some consumers feel that consumers in schools, kids, should be hearing a little bit more about plant-based diets, and that they should be hearing about switching perhaps to some of them. We want to make sure that dairy as well is part of that story. And so there are discovery education programs in the schools that bring to life what's happening on the farm for those students, as well as many thought leader programs that, again, are trying to create the leaders of tomorrow. So all of that together, action that's being inspired by some of the consumer insights that you heard today. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. And Helen, if you'd like to join me up here.
So in these presentations so far, I've seen a lot of opportunity for dairy as far as nutrients, healthy quality nutrients, clean labels. Dairy has just a tremendous opportunity out here. That being the case, why shouldn't we just look at this and say, given all the advantages we have, our marketing program has really been lousy because fluid milk has been getting killed. And what are we doing about it? We've just sat back and taken it for years and years and years. What are we going to do to turn that around? We've got the product. We've got the nutrients. We got to get that message out there better.
Sure. One thing that I'll just add with regards to it, we are seeing very, very long-term declines in the fluid milk industry. I think they go back all the way to World War II. And what we're finding from a consumer perspective is there's so much more choices in terms of beverages that are out there today that are influencing milk, sometimes in a negative fashion. We're also seeing that children today are starting to make more and more of those decisions themselves than they have in the past, and sometimes they're not necessarily choosing milk. I think there's a lot of innovation that's right now going on within the industry. Right now it's fairly small. Fairlife was brought up a little bit earlier, someone who's really trying to make a difference in terms of new benefits to that consumer. But it's obviously a very wonderful product, but not necessarily the only product from a consumer perspective that is also providing health and nutrition. And so we are seeing erosion.
But isn't the real problem with it the fact that you have brands of almond juice, soy juice? You have all these brands advertising against a generic product being just milk. Why can't we fight back at that? Why can't we go back to them and get our message out there? Why do we have to sit there and play defense and just watch it keep eroding? Why can't we take it back to them and compare our labels to theirs and really, really go after it? I mean, it just hasn't been done. Fairlife's doing a great job of it.
Yeah.
But the industry as a whole has been flat-footed on this, and just, it doesn't make sense. Our marketing on it's been terrible.
Yeah, I think also what we find in the fluid milk industry is that so much of it is private label, that there really aren't very many brands in general and national brands in particular to kind of carry that voice to the consumer. And so the amount of dollars, for example, that are put behind communicating milk to consumers is far less than some of these other brands. So in particular, as you look at these plant-based products, they are extremely well funded. And they certainly are, trying to chip away a lot of the equity, oftentimes with information that perhaps is not always, completely truthful from a consumer perspective. I think, there was mention a little bit earlier about some of the survey work that's been done to show consumers are in fact confused about some of these products on the market today. I know that there's action that's being taken right now to try to provide some commentary to FDA and hopefully trying to change some of that milk labeling that may provide a little bit more advantage to milk.
I think there's also a component of folks trying the new plant milks. There's also a variety motivation in there, like, hey, let's try something that's new. And there's ways that that dairy milk can make itself seem newer and more exciting. There are foods that are coming into food culture, things like Indian lassi and horchata. These more kind of global beverages is like a really hot space, and so there are less traditional places for drinking milk to play, and that may seem like a kind of niche example. But I think really getting an understanding of consumer culture and the places where milk is playing and where dairy milk can offer benefits over the plant-based milks is going to be a way to think about it. To get consumers out of the mindset of milk is for cereal in the morning, which I don't eat anymore because I'm too busy running out the door. Find the places where milk has an opportunity and can seem exciting and new to consumers.
And I would also add that one of the sayings that we have back at work is that be milk, but be the competition too. So in other words, continue to provide to consumers who are looking for a very highly nutritious product and love the taste of milk. Continue to present that product to them, but also look in the spaces that other products are starting to emerge and new products, and how could milk become a part of that? So for example, if we think about coffee, right? Lattes have become a very big portion of milk sales in terms of where they've been in the past. Tea, for example, now is starting to embrace milk more as an ingredient. Smoothies are another area of growth. So consumers may not necessarily always want milk by itself, but if we bring milk's nutrition to other products, I think we have a lot of opportunities, as you said a little bit earlier. Okay.
Do you have any insights from these core consumers? Can the strong ecosystem, is it believable that it could be from a farm with 1,000 cows?
Not to the standards of that ideal that they think about as the kind of the pinnacle, but could they see a farm with 1,000 cows that is thinking responsibly about how it interacts with its community, thinking about the welfare of the cows? Like, yeah, that's believable. And they know that model of a self-sustaining mini one-farm ecosystem isn't how the world works. They just want to see people aspiring to make the world a better place. And so, yeah, so the ideal is not believable from a farm with 1,000 cows, but is the sentiment believable? Yes. Or can it be? Yes.
You talk about the ecosystem and things like that. Well, I told you a couple stories on the last group here, but like about the 1,000 cow dairy thing. When we have these groups at our place, every once in a while I get somebody to talk about cows grazing on the hillside and all this stuff. It's pretty, I agree. But I had a group out, a lady from a chain store down in Houston area a few years ago. And she was talking about how her customers keep talking about cows on the grassy hillside, the little red barn, little white barn, how romantic all this is. So it's in the early fall, and I didn't know where she stood in the company, finding out she was the president of their deli department, 80 stores. So it's 88 degrees outside. And I do this on purpose. I'll put her right outside the door there with a white door right behind me. So the sun's beating off of this, right? So we're out there and we're talking about the little grassy hillside, how pretty it is. And I said, well, you know, a cow wears a leather coat. So it's really hot for her. Optimal is for a cow is what, 40 to 60 degrees. So we get inside our, what we call it's our fresh cow barn. Fans are going, sprinklers are going, feed is pushed up. They're on sand bedded, on sand for bedding. So very comfortable environment. So I said to her, remember this little, actually we got in, she gets in, she steps in, she's like, my God, is it nice in here? So I was like, ding, it's like perfect opportunity to educate another person. So I said, we remember that story we had about the cows on the hillside, and I told you when it's hot, it's really tough on a cow. She goes, yeah. I said, where would you rather be, outside or in here? Well, she said, in here, of course. I said, exactly. This is why we build these facilities for the cow comfort and care of these cows. So.
But that's a perfect story. I mean, what you just said was a totally compelling and a story that resonates with everything that consumers want to hear.
Well, and I don't have a problem with people grazing on a hillside. I think it's pretty. I grew up with this, but we've evolved and we've moved into a freestyle barn 18, 19 years ago, and it's like any other business. And we always have this discussion with people. They're like, well, why did you get bigger? I said, well, why did the Walmarts get bigger? Why did the grocery stores all go from mom and pop to the big grocery stores? It's anything else in business. We have to evolve. It's just like trying to survive. We're no different. And these people think that we're different because we produce their food. Well, we're a business too. And we always have this discussion with these folks. But you know, like I said, I grew up on the 30, 40, 50 cow dairy too. But and I hope these people make it just like the rest of us can. But it's just those situations like that where you have to educate people.
But I think the way you told your story was also particularly compelling because folks mentioned earlier about this kind of fatigue that people have for all the call-outs that they see on packaging. So what they want to see is not just, hey, our goal is to treat our animals well, but our goal is to treat animals well, and this is how we do it. We have fans in our barn. We have all these things, and that makes everything you said sound more believable and sound like, hey, this is a real-world business, and this is how a real-world business turns the ideas and the values that you have into something workable at scale. And I think that is a compelling narrative.
And I always ask these people, I said, when you go back to your businesses and you visit with your customers, tell them what you see. Tell them, you know, if they ask you a silly question out in left field, tell them what you saw then. You know, it's going to take one person at a time. I feel like we're losing this battle all the time because it's just the way it is, but we got to just keep educating and things like that. So the picture, the lady that had before this group, she had the chicken back in the 1957, and then the chicken from 2005, I think it was. It was kind of funny. They talk about the obesity rate in our country. That's kind of what I'm looking at now. But look at the sodas, the Gatorades, and all that we've put on the market over the years has a tribute to this. And I'm guilty of drinking this crap too. I love it too, just like anybody else. But that's part of, I think, our obesity problem in this country is, you know, the cup or two of sugar that we have in all this stuff, instead of going back to dairy products and just whole milk in general. So whole milk has gotten a bad rap being too much fat in it. For God's sakes, it's 3.5. We can't even advertise it that way, being 96.5% fat-free. So, just a thought.
Thank you.
All right, well, I just want to take a minute and just thank you, Helen and Madeline, for your time here today. Just a little brief announcement. We do have lunch going on downstairs in Exhibit Hall B, which is sponsored by BMO Harris Bank and Merck Animal Health, both starting at noon. The innovation stage then will run from 1 p.m. until 4:30 p.m., also in Exhibit Hall B. All right, thank you, everyone.